Darkcast Network, indie pods with a dark side.
Hello, and welcome to Tales of the Darkcast Network's Crypt Keeper. I'm your host, Jackie. Join me for this heart-stopping episode of Dark Tales from Darkcast. Please step forward into the crypt carefully. Keep your hands to yourself, or they could end up being someone else's. Don't touch anything, and you might come out of this in one piece. I trust that everyone brought a change of clothes. Yours may get soiled before this is over. Let's begin our first story, shall we?
Hey, true crimers. I'm Hopper Daly, host of The Final Trace. Normally, I tell a true crime story to my best friend Mackenzie. She's the one asking the questions you're probably asking at home, or the ones I never even thought of. But tonight, for this Darkcast original Halloween special, I'm going solo. The story I have for you today isn't an urban legend. It's the true story of the night Halloween changed forever. I'm your host, Hopper Daly, and this is The Final Trace of the Candyman. Every Halloween, parents whisper warnings. Blades and apples, needles and Snickers, a stranger with a sweet smile and poison candy. Most of those fears are just urban legends. But in 1974, on a cold October night in Texas, one of those legends came true. This is the story of the Halloween that turned into a nightmare. A story that haunted October 31st for over half a century. Because sometimes the truth is darker than the myth. It's October 31st, 1974. Deer Park, Texas. Children dart from house to house, pillowcases and plastic pumpkins clutched in their hands, the sight of glowing jack-o'-lanterns on every porch. Among them, Timothy O'Brien, 8 years old. Excited, dressed up, his little sister Elizabeth tagging along. Their father takes them door to door, joined by a neighbor and his 2 kids. At one darkened house, no one answers the door. The kids get bored and run ahead. Timothy and Elizabeth's dad, he waits. But soon, he catches up, holding 5 long pixie sticks given to him from the occupant of the house that was slow to answer the door. He hands one to each child, and the last one to a child passing by. They all add them to their candy haul and continue on with the night. Later, back at home, Timothy is allowed one last treat before bed. He chooses the pixie stick. He struggles to get the powder out that had clumped together until his dad helps him out and loosens it. Moments after swallowing the powder, Timothy feels sick. He holds his stomach and begins to vomit. He cries out, "Daddy, my stomach hurts," before collapsing. By the time they reach the hospital, Timothy is gone. Tests showed that the pixie sticks were laced with cyanide, enough poison in just 2 inches to kill several adults. Panic erupts, police scramble, parents tore through trick-or-treat bags across Houston, terrified that their children had been given deadly candy. The press dubbed the mystery culprit the man who killed Halloween, because if one stranger was handing out poison candy, every kid was in danger. Investigators rushed to track the source. They questioned neighbors, retraced trick-or-treat routes, candy bags, all sourced. They finally recovered the other pixie sticks before any other child could eat them. But slowly, the story began to shift. The evidence didn't point to a stranger lurking in the shadows. It pointed to someone much closer. All of the poison candy traced back to a single hand, and that hand belonged to Timothy's father. Ronald Clark O'Brien, 30 years old, an optician by trade, a deacon at the Second Baptist Church. Outwardly, a steady family man. But beneath that polished exterior, his life was crumbling. The bills were piling up. He was drowning in debt, so desperate that he began quietly taking out life insurance policies on his children. Small amounts at first, but over time they grew. By the time Halloween rolled around in 1974, the combined payout reached tens of thousands of dollars, worth well over $500,000 in today's money. To Ronald, those numbers gleamed like a lifeline, and on Halloween night, he convinced himself he'd found the perfect way out. The chaos of trick-or-treating, the flood of candy, the faceless crowds. If something went wrong, if a child got sick or died, who would ever trace it back to him? That night, he slipped cyanide-laced pixie sticks into the hands of children. One for his son, Timothy, one for his daughter, two for his neighbor kids, and one to a 10-year-old he recognized from church, meant to scatter suspicion, to make it look more like the work of a deranged stranger. But behind the mask of Halloween, the real monster wasn't in the shadows. He was standing in plain sight. A father who gambled his own child's life for money. The only reason that no one else died was chance. One boy fell asleep with a pixie stick unopened beside him. Another couldn't get past the staple that Ronald had used to reseal it. In the end, fate, not Ronald's mercy, kept the body count from rising. A twist of luck, a quirk of timing, and 4 children who never knew how close death had come crawling into their Halloween night. Ronald was arrested days later. At trial, prosecutors laid it all out. The debts, the insurance, the plan. The jury took less than an hour to convict him of capital murder. In 1975, Ronald Clark O'Brien was sentenced to death. Nearly a decade later, on March 31st, 1984, his sentence was carried out. He was strapped to the gurney, a needle in his arm, the sterile hum of the machines replacing the chaos he had once unleashed. Outside the prison that night, crowds of people gathered in the night air, their voices cutting through the darkness. They weren't there to mourn. They weren't there to pray. As the poison flowed into his veins, they shouted into the Texas night, "Trick or treat." Ronald Clark O'Brien will always be remembered as the Candyman, the father who poisoned Halloween. His crime became a legend, the fuel for whispered warnings passed from parent to child every October. Candy bags dumped onto kitchen tables, wrappers inspected under the glow of a porch light. Fear that the boogeyman was out there, slipping poison into sweets. But the truth is far darker than the legend, because there was no faceless stranger lurking in the night. The real monster, he wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was standing in the doorway, holding his son's hand. For more haunting true crime stories that linger in the shadows, follow us on Instagram and TikTok at The Final Trace Podcast. Find us wherever you stream your podcast. And remember, not all secrets stay buried.
Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is October 31st. On this day in 1982, it was Halloween night in South Central Indiana. Just north of Seymour, 2 men left a small house together. The next morning, one man went about his normal life. The other, 24-year-old Clifford Smith, was gone. Days later, his wife filed a missing persons report. A month later, 2 trappers found his body floating in a backwater pool off of the White River. For more than 40 years, the case sat unsolved, while rumors floated around bars and living rooms across Jackson County. That is, until a new detective picked up the old file, reopened the story, and finally gave the Smith family the answers they'd waited decades to hear. Today, we're talking about the disappearance and murder of Clifford Smith and the answers that took over 4 decades to find. Let's get started. Late on October 30th, 1982, it was Halloween weekend in Seymour, Indiana, a small industrial town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. That night, a few friends had gathered at a modest house on East 13th Street for a few drinks and a casual weekend get-together. Among the people drifting in and out that night were Cliff Smith, who was just 24 years old, and his brother-in-law, Ronald Jack Anderson. As the night wound down, Anderson reportedly went to go fetch something. Witnesses would later tell police that they saw him retrieve a shotgun loaded right there in the house and then walk outside with Cliff. It was close to midnight when the two men got into a car and drove off. And that was the last time anyone saw Cliff Smith alive. By morning, there was no sign of him. Sunday came and went. Halloween passed. Clifford's wife waited, though, thinking maybe that he'd gone off with friends or needed time to cool down after some argument that no one quite remembered. But as the days stretched on and the silence deepened, her worry gave way to full-blown panic. On November 4th, 1982, she went to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office and filed a missing persons report. Deputies started canvassing, checking the gravel roads north of town, knocking on doors, and writing down the names of everyone who'd been at that East 13th Street house that night. But no one was talking. Not about the shotgun or about Cliff leaving with Ronald Anderson. Those statements would take decades to make their way to police. Because witnesses were clamming up, there wasn't really anywhere for the case to go at that point. But then, at about 8 p.m. on December 1st, 1982, two animal trackers working a low, swampy stretch off the White River made a horrifying discovery. In a shallow, flood-prone bayou, they saw something pale floating in the water. When they realized what it was, they called state police. Troopers and a coroner waded in under flashlights. The body was dressed in blue jeans, a black t-shirt, and brown boots. In one pocket, they found a wallet and an ID card. It belonged to Clifford Smith. The body was partially decomposed, and the top portion of his head was gone. An autopsy later found numerous pieces of buckshot and ruled the cause of death to be a shotgun wound to the head. Local newspapers reported what little they knew. Clifford had last been seen on Halloween. His wife had reported him missing 5 days later. And now, a month after that, he'd been found dead in a backwater just north of Seymour. Detectives mapped out the narrow, muddy lane leading from the road to the water, marking tire tracks, footprints, anything that might still linger in the soft ground. They believed that the killer knew the area and the remote dump site wasn't random. That suspicion only deepened as they traced the evidence back toward town and to the small house on East 13th Street where Clifford had last been seen alive. Over the next several months, investigators interviewed witnesses, gathered physical evidence, and followed every lead that they could. But like so many small-town murder cases in the early 80s, this one just hit a wall. There were rumors about a fight, about money, about a gun, but no one gave them anything solid enough to take to a prosecutor. So the trail went cold. As years turned into decades, the case was passed from one detective to another. Boxes of reports and evidence moved from shelves to storage rooms. And for over 40 years, that was the end of the story. Then, in September 2015, a veteran detective named Sergeant Kip Main from the Indiana State Police pulled the case file off of the shelf. Inside were the original 1982 reports. Yellowed pages typed on old forms, black and white photographs of the recovery site, and a list of every interview that had been done that fall. He started reading, and then he started over. Unlike the DNA-driven cold cases that make headlines, this one wasn't solved by new science. It was solved by patience and persistence. Main re-interviewed witnesses. He tracked down surviving family members. He compared every statement from 1982 to what people remembered more than 30 years later. One by one, inconsistencies fell away, and this time, the picture began to come into focus. A house on East 13th Street, a loaded shotgun, two men leaving together, and one gun quietly returned later that night. And it all pointed back to Ronald Jack Anderson. By 2023, investigators believed that they finally had enough evidence to prove who killed Cliff Smith. On October 31st, 2023, 41 years to the day after Cliff Smith was killed, the Indiana State Police announced that they had made an arrest. Detectives took 61-year-old Ronald Jack Anderson into custody in his home in Seymour and charged him with murder. The details hit hard in the small town. Not only had Cliff Smith been denied justice for over 4 decades, but the man accused of killing him was his own brother-in-law. Over the next year and a half, the case worked its way through the courts. In April 2025, after months of negotiation, Anderson pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. As part of the deal, the original murder charge was dismissed. A month later, in May 2025, a judge sentenced him to 18 years in prison. For the prosecution, it wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. After 4 decades, they could finally say what happened to Clifford Smith and who was responsible. The story that began on a riverbank in 1982 ended in a courtroom more than 40 years later. But at its heart, this is the story of a 24-year-old man who never made it home from a Halloween party, and of all of the people who never stopped looking for justice. But sometimes justice takes years. Sometimes it takes lifetimes. But on another Halloween, 41 years after the night Clifford Smith vanished, someone was finally held accountable.
Hi, I'm Courtney, and I am the host of The Book of the Dead. And this is the legend of the SS Ourang Medan. Now, some of you may be familiar, at least in the abstract, of what the SS Ourang Medan is. There is a video game by Supermassive Games called Man of Medan, and it is based on this legend, the story of a ship transporting chemical weaponry. But the actual legend is without a doubt stranger than fiction. It may be one of the most mysterious ships of all time. And there is a lot of conflicting information out there, and we're going to get into why. But supposedly, the legend goes as follows. Sometime in the late 1940s, along the Straits of Malacca, which is in between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, an SOS broadcast was made. The message was received by nearby ships, and they were extremely alarmed by what they heard. The message said, "All officers, including Captain, dead, lying in chart room and on bridge, probably whole crew dead." This message was immediately followed by a series of Morse code that no one could make out because of how rapid the code was. And then one final message came through, and the officer said, "I die." Now, obviously, the ships that received this transmission were more than concerned for multiple reasons. And one of the main ones was that the crew members sending out this SOS gave no indication as to what caused the death of the crew, what their coordinates were, or what sort of danger these crew members were in. So the ships sailing out to rescue them were going in completely blind. According to what seems to be the original legend, an American ship called the Silver Star was the ship that answered the distress call and organized a rescue mission. They figure out the approximate coordinates of the ship's location, and they immediately set sail into the unknown, not knowing what horrors could be awaiting them aboard the Ourang Medan. Supposedly, they arrive, and when they call out to the ship, there is no answer, no movement on the ship. So the captain of the Silver Star organizes a crew to board the Ourang Medan and help them. When this rescue crew gets onto the ship, they are met with a terrifying sight. Not one single sailor is alive. Everyone is dead, and they are all exactly where the man that made the distress call said they would be. The chart room, the bridge, the officer that made the broadcast is dead in the radio room, and every single person on the ship is lying there with their eyes looking up, their faces turned to the sun, frozen in fear, their teeth bared in horror. Even the ship's dog is dead, frozen mid-snarl. According to the original legend, allegedly as the rescue crew was looking around, trying to figure out what happened, a fire was discovered in the bowels of the ship, smoke billowing out of the cargo hold. The rescue crew abandons the ship, and as they flee back to the Silver Star, an explosion erupts so forcefully that the Ourang Medan was literally lifted out of the water before sinking to the bottom of the ocean floor. But what happened? How did the crew die? And how did the fire start? Is this even a real story, or is it a ghost story crewmen made up to pass the time that morphed into a horrifying mystery? According to multiple sources, there is allegedly no mention of a ship called the Ourang Medan in any shipping registry, and there is no official record of this incident from the 1940s when this allegedly occurred. However, various versions of this story have been printed in newspapers from the 1950s onward. Now, one of the theories as to why there's no mention of this ship in any registry is because it's a ship that was registered as belonging to the island of Sumatra, which is an island off western Indonesia. The reason people believe this could be a possibility is because Ourang Medan translates to man from Medan, and Medan is the capital of North Sumatra. Now, according to German researcher Professor Theodor Seiersdorfer, he discovered a German publication from 1953 called Das Totenschiff in der Südsee, or The Death Ship in the South Seas. This was written by a man named Otto Melke, and it is believed to contain evidence that the ship and what happened to it was a real event. Now, allegedly, this claims that the ship's cargo hold contained potassium cyanide and nitroglycerin. If it did, this could explain the explosion if the containers were compromised or mishandled in some way. And it could explain why the ship's legitimacy is so iffy, because a ship would never have legally been able to transport something like that. The reason being was because tensions during World War II, when this incident was supposed to have occurred, was very high, and sensitive materials being transported and used inappropriately or maliciously would cause a lot of problems internationally, which is a reason why the ship's records are so hard to find or have never been found. According to Michael East, a history and true crime writer, he said nobody came forward to say they knew the ship or had served on her. Equally, the inconsistent dates constantly stand out, as does the changing location. Mentions of the fate of the Ourang Medan have been found in publications scattered from 1930 to 1940s, and every one of them have details changed. Locations vary from the Solomon Islands to the Marshall Islands, and even the ship that tried to rescue them varies. Researcher Estelle Hargraves found quotes from the 1940s in British national newspapers from British Marine officers describing a distress call requesting a medic and warship. And these newspaper articles also claim that it was a British ship that attempted a rescue mission, not the Silver Star. Articles found by Estelle Hargraves in the Yorkshire Evening Post, the Daily Mirror, and the Hampshire Telegraph claim this accident occurred in November of 1940, and they place it occurring in the Solomon Islands in the Melanesian region of the Pacific Ocean. In the Yorkshire Evening Post, their information is supposedly from an officer from an unnamed ship that tried to come to the Ourang Medan's aid. Now, allegedly, according to author Alexander Butzig, who wrote the book The Ourang Medan, Conjuring a Ghost Ship, he found an article from a French magazine from September 7, 1941, that claims this incident occurred in 1939, and it places the location as being around Fiji, and the ship was supposedly an Australian ship that had been sold to a smuggler and was smuggling illegal cargo. However, Michael East blames the changing details on a reporter named Silvio Shirelli. Silvio Shirelli is a name heavily attached to the Ourang story. Silvio wrote and published his own version of the Ourang Medan story after allegedly coming across a survivor that washed up on the shores of Taongi Atoll in the Marshall Islands. In 1948, a Dutch-Indonesian newspaper, De Locomotief, published the story where Silvio claimed he was told the ship was traveling to Costa Rica from a Chinese port because of the illegal cargo they were carrying, which was sulfuric acid. Supposedly, this survivor's name was Jerry Rabbit. According to Jerry, he washed up on the shore of the Marshall Islands 10 days after the Ourang Medan sank in a lifeboat with 6 other crew members, but he was the only survivor. Rabbit made it to a missionary and reportedly told them that he joined the Oorang Medan's crew in Shanghai, and the crew was loading 15,000 crates of mysterious cargo into the bowels of the ship. He claimed that after they set sail to Costa Rica, he realized that this was a smuggling operation. According to this report, Jerry said that after men on the cruise started growing sick, he investigated what the ship was carrying, and he found out via a logbook that the crates they were transporting contained sulfuric acid, potassium cyanide, and nitroglycerin. After men started dying, Jerry escaped on the lifeboat, and he allegedly died himself soon after telling the story. The problem is, there is no mention of Jerry Rabbit existing at all outside of this article. This article claims the cargo was mishandled or not stored properly, and the escaping fumes caused the crew's death and caused the explosion. Now, toxic fumes killing the crew is the most common theory, with minor differences. Some claim the fumes alone killed them, and some claim the fumes caused horrific hallucinations that literally scared these crew members to death. Another theory points to a pirate attack, which, given the time this would have occurred, could have been a possibility, except for the fact that the bodies on board reportedly showed no injuries. A different article by Les Hewitt claims that the incident occurred either June 1947 or February 1948, but none of these dates are consistent. According to this article, 2 ships picked up the distress call from the Oorang Medan, the Silver Star, and the SS City of Baltimore. With the help of a Dutch ship and a British listening post, they were able to figure out the coordinates of the Oorang Medan, and the Silver Star set out on a rescue mission. The Oorang Medan was found around 150 miles from the broadcast coordinates. Now, according to this article, the rescue crew noticed a few other things besides the deceased crew. One of the lifeboats attached to the side of the ship was missing, which means, or at least implies, that some of the crew managed to get off the ship. The temperature of the ship itself was somewhere between 100 and 110 degrees, but the rescue crew felt an unnatural chill, seemingly coming from nowhere. The bodies of the crew were unwounded, but they seemed to be decaying faster than they should be, though if the ship was that hot, it would accelerate decomposition. However, there are some glaring issues with these dates. For the articles claiming the Silver Star was the ship to come to the rescue, it's not possible, because the ship that was named the Silver Star was not called that until after this incident supposedly happened. The ship was registered under the name Santa Juana, and the name wasn't changed until the Graceline Shipping Company bought the rights to the ship's registry and changed the name. In fact, the ship was only called the Silver Star for about 1 year before the name changed again. Now, the Oorang Medan was completely undamaged, so they were going to tow the ship back to port to salvage it when they noticed smoke coming from the cargo hold. Also, according to this article, the first official mention of this incident is from the U.S. Coast Guard in May of 1952. Another theory has to do with chemical warfare. According to this theory, the Japanese might have smuggled experimental biological weaponry they created onto the ship for transport. This was called Unit 731, and this theory goes on to say that the Japanese aimed to create the most dangerous weapon in order to achieve Japanese supremacy. Allegedly, Unit 731 was developed in 1932 by a Japanese bacteriologist named Shiro Ishii, who conducted horrific experiments during World War II, which is an entire story in and of itself. The last mention of the SS Oorang Medan comes from a letter written by a man named C.H. Mark in December 1959. This letter was written to Alan Dulles, the assistant director of the CIA. And in the letter, C.H. Mark claims that he has evidence that the Oorang Medan existed and that its demise came from great balls of fire in the sky. And he wanted confirmation that he was correct. But Mr. Dulles only replied, "Thank you for your inquiry." As for the final resting place of the Oorang Medan, no one has ever figured out where it sank. There had been no wrecks found along the Straits of Malacca, and no identified ships matching its description were ever found. No one knows, or may ever know, if the Oorang Medan truly existed. But if it did, the ocean took its secrets to the very depths where no one may ever find it. Again, I'm Courtney from the Book of the Dead.
Hi everyone, I'm Pat.
And I'm Darcy.
And we are the hosts of Pod of Terror. Welcome everyone to the Darkcast Network Halloween special. A lot of really, really good stories for you. The spooky Halloween. And we're here with one of those too. Halloween night in 2011 was not a fun one for first responders in Chicago. When the police arrived at an address in Winchester Avenue, the paramedics were already there, trying to help 49-year-old Maria Adams. There was lots of blood everywhere, broken dishes, and 3 knives in the sink. Maria was found face down, having suffered multiple lacerations and puncture wounds to the face and hands, and altogether she had over 20 stab wounds and lacerations, some of which led investigators to believe that they had been carried out by someone holding 2 knives, one in each hand. So think like fucking windmill situation when you're literally going at someone.
Right.
Yeah, so that's quite dramatic.
Yeah,
there were also injuries to her head. So she was either stomped on or had her head slammed on the floor. So really, really violent. Unfortunately, Maria died almost a week later on the 5th of November. All of this has happened because of a bag of Halloween candy.
No.
Yeah, it's about to get weird, everyone. Liddell Peoples met Maria Adams in 2007. According to him, he'd give her money and gifts in exchange for sex, and she would sometimes spend the night at his place. So I don't know the exact nature of this relationship, but it seems very transactional, of course. But they seem to have had like some sort of arrangement.
And they're 2 adults, right?
Yeah, so do what you want.
Do what you want, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe she just, I honestly don't know what the fuck is going on here. But yeah, they knew each other. They would kind of bonk and he would like give her dinner. I don't know.
Right.
Standard, right? So that Halloween, Liddell noticed that a bag of his candy was missing. And he was really mad because it wasn't the first time like things would kind of disappear when Maria was around. So he confronted her and she denied having seen it anyway. She was like, I don't know what you're talking about, mate. You're tripping.
But to be fair, if my bag of candy was missing, babe, I'd be upset.
There would be words at least, for sure. Yeah, 100%. But yeah, she was like, I don't know, mate, never seen it. I don't know what candy you're talking about. Well, he apparently found it in her coat pocket.
Oh, she did take it.
She did take it. Well, allegedly she took it. That's what he said. So, it's unclear exactly like what happened here, like how the fight started. But at some point, Maria threw a plate at Liddell and hit him right above his right eye. And in the mugshot, you can actually see he's got like a nasty little gash above his eyebrow. But, it's possible he lunged at her first in the kitchen and she just basically threw a plate to defend herself. We don't really know. Yeah. He claims some other things. We don't know. But he claimed that she threw it unprovoked. Like, just randomly decided to throw a plate at him, apparently. I don't know about that.
I don't think so, but okay.
Okay, let's roll with that, right? Yeah, and that made him mad, apparently, so he started walking towards her, and that's when she grabbed 2 steak knives. He wrestled them away from her, and then he managed to wrestle her to the ground and began swinging the knives, aiming for the face. Like, with both his hands, just literally going at it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely fucking awful. He stopped when she turned over and stopped fighting back. When she just got quiet, he was like, all right. It's believed that he then grabbed her by the hair and slammed her head into the ground 3 times. She was moaning, and he said that he didn't know if she was faking it or what. Them bitches can't be trusted, can they? Like, is she actually dying or not? I don't know, mate.
I just slammed her head a few times.
Did you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's your play fight, right? Whatever, man. Yeah, so he wasn't sure if she was pretending, if she was whatever the fuck he claimed was happening. I don't know. He then stomped on her back, on the back of her head once more, grabbed the biggest knife from the kitchen drawer and then poked her with it. Basically like, you alive? You alive? Are you alive? Just to see if she moves or if she talks or if anything happens. Of course, she didn't move. Liddell considered dumping her somewhere outside. He was like, I can just kind of get rid of her, can't I? She's just find a body. But because they'd had sex earlier that night, like literally an hour earlier, he thought that the cops would find him anyway. They would connect her body to him. So he was like, nah, I don't want anyone to think I raped her, He didn't want that fucking charge on top of everything else. So he was like, I'd better just not do that because, I don't know. I imagine thinking that his DNA sample or details were already somewhere in the police system.
Probably, yeah.
That kind of line of thinking. But,
Also, you're going to get that mad over a bag of candy? You must have problems before.
Do you know what I mean? Something's going on here. I have no idea, mate. But yeah, he was like, no, I'm not going to just dump her because I don't want another rape charge for something I didn't do, because I'm not that kind of man, you know. I'm not a rapist.
Yeah, interesting that you went there.
I know. So instead, he got dressed and he called 911. When the police officers got there, they kind of thought that he seemed all right. Like, he seemed together. There was no dramatics. There was no theatrics. He was just kind of, you know, just a guy.
Right.
Just a guy sitting on the front porch, basically waiting for them. Yeah, he was absolutely fine. He told them he didn't want to hurt her. It was self-defense, basically. She was holding the knives, and when she hit him with the plate, he saw his own blood on his fingers, and he really freaked out. And that's when he kind of lost control, and he kind of went for it. Later, during the trial, he claims that he didn't remember saying anything about all of that, or saying anything about slamming her head into the ground, or considering hiding her body, which is what he fucking told them when they first arrested him. But he was like, I don't remember saying that. No, I didn't say that. If I don't remember it didn't happen.
My lawyer told me it was a bad idea, so no, I don't remember.
Innit? And then he said in court that, in fact, at the time of that incident, he was actually falling in love with her. He didn't want her to get hurt. He loved her. Yeah. So Liddell was facing charges of first-degree murder and aggravated domestic battery. He pleaded not guilty because, you know, he was self-defense. He loved her. He was, of course, found guilty and sentenced to 30 years in prison. And the sentence was then appealed. Basically, his defense claimed that at 29, he was 55 at the time of the incident. At 29, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so a psychiatrist's statement should have been allowed. And they argued for a lesser sentence of second-degree murder because of that. But he was ill. He was mentally ill.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in the end, there was a bit of, you know, pushing and pulling and all of that. But the courts decided that it's irrelevant, actually, because the state of Illinois doesn't recognize diminished responsibility defense. They just don't fucking buy that. They don't believe, they don't do it. If anything, they would have to go for insanity defense, which they didn't. So, you know, they were like, we don't do that here, darling. Bye-bye for the next 30 years, Liddell. Like, good luck to you. And the psychiatrist, Dr. Harlan, said that Liddell suffered from schizoaffective disorder, paranoid schizophrenia, cognitive disorder, and cocaine abuse, and a very, very strong addiction to candy. Apparently. So there you have it, a story about a man who killed his missus, or whoever the fuck she was to him, over a bag of goddamn candy.
I mean, honestly, at your grown age, you shouldn't be that sad. It shouldn't have triggered this kind of fight.
Honestly, like, I'm sure.
Come on.
It sounds to me like there perhaps was violence in this kind of scenario before.
Yes.
These sound like people who have some sort of, they are damaged.
I think so,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
The cocaine abuse,
Yeah.
I'm sure that's not fucking helpful in any case anyway. But yeah, just a really horrendous how things can escalate over such a minor thing that you would never even... I mean, would you kill over a bag of candy? I probably
No, but
wouldn't.
I don't think I'll be touching anyone's candy from now on.
Keep your fucking
Yes.
fingers to yourselves. That's the lesson from today. Don't steal Halloween candy because look how it might end up. So that's our lesson for tonight.
Have you ever had your Halloween candy stolen?
No. I mean, I've never really done it. It's not a thing.
Really?
No, yeah. These days, I try to have a couple of bags of candy and just like give it to the kids. But a lot of the time, they just don't bother coming.
It depends on the area that you grew up in. Because there's some parts on London where they actually make an effort, but it's definitely a very American thing.
It is, yeah. It's not so big here.
But one time when we were kids, right, we went we really wanted to do trick-or-treating, so we were like, come, let's try it out. And then my little brother came with me as well, and he was wearing like a really scary mask. And the area we grew up in, there was zero Halloween anything on there. There was nobody at decorations. It wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
So we went to our neighbors, and one of our neighbors, most of them didn't even answer. Some of them did, and they were like, oh no, like they were giving us whatever they could find, like biscuits.
It's a paracetamol. Here's an apple.
Literally, they were like, oh, I had no idea. I think one family were having a wedding, so they actually had sweets, and they gave us some nice stuff. Most people were just like trying to, like, felt bad and gave us things.
Bless.
One time, one of the houses we went to, the lady had no idea it was Halloween or anything. She's on the phone, she answers the door, my brother's standing right there with the mask. She got so panicked, she fell to the ground.
Oh no.
Screaming, yeah.
Oh no. This is what happens when you do Halloween in places that don't do Halloween.
And then we were like super apologetic, and she was like, it's okay. Now I have to find something to give you guys. And then she just went running into her kitchen.
That just means the costume was great.
Yes.
Candy was well deserved. Thank you very much for that, guys. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoy your spooky season and enjoy all the other stories from Darkcast Network. Give all of them a go. They're all fantastic. We've been Pat
and Darcy,
host of Pod of Terror. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your Halloween.
Hey everyone, I'm Carmita, and I host a podcast called Missing in the PNW. I focus on missing person cases right here in the Pacific Northwest where I grew up, and all of my missing persons are from marginalized communities. The PNW has some of the most haunted places. Today, I'm going to take you on a tour of 3 of the most haunted places in my home state of Oregon. The first stop is Multnomah Falls. One of the most popular tourist spots in Oregon is a half-hour drive east of where I grew up in Portland on I-84. Going towards the Columbia River Gorge, you will run into signs for Multnomah Falls, a 620-foot high, 2-tier, beautiful waterfall. It is the tallest waterfall in Oregon, the most hiked, and draws nearly 2 million visitors per year. But what many people may not know is actually has a haunted past. My grandma actually told me and my siblings this story growing up, as it is an old Native American tale. And if you heard my podcast before, you'd know I'm half Mexican and half Native American. The story goes that long ago, a deadly illness ravaged a local Native village. An elder spoke to the tribe and said that the only way the illness could be stopped was by the sacrifice of a maiden of noble honor. The village's chief had a daughter. She took it upon herself to sacrifice herself to spare her people. She climbed to the top where the waterfall now is and jumped off, giving herself for her village. With that sacrifice, her village was cleansed, and the waterfall was created by a spirit so that her people would always remember her courage, and so that the mist of the waterfall would cleanse and heal those who visited the site. If you look closely, many people say that you can see the young woman's face in the waterfall. Most commonly, you can see her in the water in the wintertime. I've actually seen her spirit, or the face of her spirit, in the waterfall myself. I am now taking you to the Oregon coast, 13 miles north of a little town called Florence, where atop a 205-foot headland stands the 56-foot tall Heceta Head Lighthouse. Over the years, many men would keep the lighthouse running, and just up the hill from the lighthouse was an actual house that their families could stay in. One particular member of one particular family is said to have never left. Many call her the Gray Lady, but for the last couple of decades, she has been known as Rue, R-U-E. At least, that is the name a couple of Lane Community College kids gave her after they decided to play with an Ouija board in the house. Good old Ouija boards, right? Legend has it that Rue's husband was a lighthouse keeper and had 2 daughters. One of her daughters unfortunately drowned, although it's not mentioned if her daughter drowned in the house or if her daughter drowned in the ocean. While her husband and other daughter moved on, she, however, did not. And she's not a mean ghost by any means, but she mostly likes to play pranks on people. She will rearrange furniture, move guest belongings, and she's even known to clean up the place. Hey, who doesn't like a ghost that's clean? She's not just in the house either, though, with some sightings of her inside the actual lighthouse. That actually makes me believe that she's looking out over to the Pacific Ocean. With that, I believe if the story is true, her daughter unfortunately died and drowned in the Pacific Ocean. The last haunted place we are going is 300 miles from Portland in far eastern Oregon to a place called Baker City, which is home to the Grand Geyser Hotel. One of the most prominent ghosts is the lady in blue. She is believed to be a former owner, possibly named Grandma Annabelle, who is seen in mirrors walking downstairs and sitting in room 302. Not to be confused by that creepy little doll Annabelle. Totally, completely different. There are also a bunch of sightings of many unknown male entities, ladies in red, and even a headless cook. What would a haunted hotel be without some spooky sounds, right? Guests have reported hearing disembodied voices, a woman screaming, laughter, and footsteps. Guests have also seen lights flickering, doors opening and closing by themselves, and objects moving on their own. Now, not all the paranormal going on in the hotel is creepy. Some of the workers at the hotel say that they can hear loud music coming from the upper floors and the attic, and they believe the ghosts are up there having a party, and they just don't disturb them. Guess you gotta have fun in the afterlife too, right? That is all I have for you today. And I just want to give a shout out to CJ and all of my other Darkcast members. I'm so excited to be a part of this year's Darkcast Halloween episode. And I hope you catch Missing in the PNW. I am on all the streaming platforms. You can catch me on Facebook or Instagram at Missing in the PNW Podcast. And I will talk to you next time, guys. Happy Halloween. And remember, have fun, but be safe.
Good evening, listeners. My name is DJ, and I'm the host of the Mythical True Crime Podcast. Tonight, we're going to hear about one of the most infamous killers that has spawned multiple copycats and has inspired pop culture films and television shows. Most recently, Netflix's Monsters, the Ed Gein story. Edward Theodore Gein was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, late August 27th, 1906. He was the second of two sons from George Gein and Augusta Gein. Now, the Gein's only sibling he had was an older brother named Henry. Augusta, his mother, who was fervently religious and nominally Lutheran, frequently preached to her sons about the innate immorality of the world, such as the evils of drinking and her belief that all women were naturally promiscuous and instruments of the devil. She reserved every afternoon to read from the Bible, usually selecting verses from Old Testament to the Book of Revelation concerning death, murder, and divine retribution. Edward idolized and eventually became obsessed with his mother. In La Crosse, Gein's father worked as a carpenter, tanner, and a firefighter. He also owned a local grocery store, but soon sold his business and left the city with his family to live on a 155-acre farm in the town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, which became their permanent residence. Gein's father was known to be a violent alcoholic who regularly beat both of his sons. This caused Ed's ears to ring when his father beat him over the head. Augusta took advantage of the farm's isolation by turning away outsiders who could have influenced her sons. Edward left the farm only to attend school, and outside of school, he spent most of his time doing chores on the farm. He was very shy. Classmates and teachers remembered him as having strange mannerisms, such as seemingly random laughter, as if he was laughing at his own personal jokes. Augusta punished Edward every time he tried to make friends. According to family acquaintances, despite his poor social development, Edward was fairly well in school, particularly at reading. Now, on April 1st, 1940, the Gein brothers' father had a fatal heart attack at the age of 66. Ed and his brother were doing odd jobs around town to help cover living expenses. The brothers were generally considered reliable and honest to the rest of the community. While both worked as handymen, Ed frequently babysat for neighbors, seemingly to relate more easily to children than to adults. Henry began dating a woman who was a divorcee with 2 children of her own and planned to move in with her. He worried that his brother's attachment to their mother and often spoke ill of her around Edward, who always responded with shock and hurt. However, on May 16, 1944, Ed was burning away most of the marsh vegetation on the property, and this caused a fire to go out of control, drawing the attention of the local fire department. By the end of that day, the fire had been extinguished, and the firefighters left. However, Ed reported Henry missing. With lanterns and flashlights, a search party searched for the 43-year-old Henry, whose dead body was found lying face down. Apparently, Henry had been dead for some time. Didn't seem to be caused by the fire. However, it did appear the cause of death was heart failure. It was later reported by a biographer that Henry had bruises on his head. Police dismissed the possibility of foul play, and the county coroner listed it as asphyxiation as the cause of death. The authorities accepted the accident theory, but there was no official investigation conducted, and the autopsy was never performed. Questioning Ed about the death of Bernice Worden in 1957, state investigator Joe Wilimowski brought up questions about Henry's death to him. George Arndt, who studied the case, wrote later in retrospect that it was possibly unlikely that Henry's death was sort of a Cain and Abel aspect, and Ed was the one that carried out the murder. With Henry deceased, Ed and his mother were now alone. Augusta suffered a paralyzing stroke shortly after Henry's death, and Ed devoted the rest of himself for her care. Sometime in 1945, he later recounted that he and his mother visited a man named Smith who lived nearby to purchase straw. According to Edward, Augusta witnessed Smith beating a dog, and a woman inside the Smith residence came out and yelled at him to stop, but Smith went ahead and beat the dog literally to death. Augusta was extremely upset by this scene. What bothered her most didn't appear to be the brutality towards the dog, but rather the presence of the woman there. Augusta then later told Ed that the woman was not married to Smith, so had no business of even being there, angrily calling her Smith's harlot. She suffered a second stroke soon after, and her health deteriorated rapidly. Augusta died on December 29, 1945, at the age of only 67. Edward, devastated by the death of his mother, in the words of his biographer, only had his friend and his only true love gone. He was absolutely alone in the world. Now, Ed held on to the farm and earned money, again doing odd jobs. He boarded up rooms used by his mother, including the upstairs and downstairs parlor and the living room, leaving them seemingly untouched, while the rest of the house became increasingly squalid. These rooms became pristine. Ed lived in the small room next to the kitchen. Around this time, he began interested in reading pulp magazines and adventure stories, particularly those involving cannibals or Nazi atrocities, specifically concerning Ilse Koch, who had been accused of selecting tattooed prisoners for death to fashion lampshades and other items of their skins. In 1951, Edward started receiving a farm subsidy from the federal government. He still worked occasionally at the local municipal rail crew and crop threshing crews up in Plainfield area. However, sometime between 1946 and 1956, he had then sold an additional 80-acre parcel of his land. On the morning of November 15, 1957, 58-year-old Plainfield hardware store owner Bernice Worden was reported disappeared. The hardware store's truck had been seen driving out of the rear of the building at around 9:30 a.m. that day. The store saw very few customers the entire day, and some area residents believe that this was because it was deer hunting season. Worden's son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, entered the store around 5 p.m. to find the cash register open with bloodstains on the floor. Frank told investigators that the evening before his mother's disappearance, Gein had been seen at the store and was expecting to return the next morning for a gallon of antifreeze. A sales slip of the antifreeze was the last receipt written by Bernice Worden on the morning that she disappeared. That evening, Gein was arrested at West Playfield grocery store, and the sheriff's department searched his farm. The sheriff deputy discovered not just Worden's decapitated body in the shed of Gein's property, who was also hung upside down by her legs and a crossbar between her ankles and ropes at her wrists. Her torso had been, in his words, dressed like a deer. Worden had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and the mutilations were made after her death. Searching Gein's house, authorities found multiple artifacts, such as a whole human bones and fragments of skeletons, a wastebasket made of human skin covering several chairs, a human skull mounted on bedposts, female skulls on top of some tops sawn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a human torso skinned from shoulders to waist, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made of skin from female heads, Mary Hogan's face mask on a paper bag. Mary Hogan's skull was inside of a box. Bernice Holden's entire head was inside of a burlap sack, as well as her heart in a plastic bag in front of Gein's potbelly stove. 9 vulvas inside of a shoebox. A young girl's dress and 2 vulvas from 2 females, judged to be about 15 years old. A belt made from female human nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips with a window shade drawstring, and a lampshade made from skin of a human face. These artifacts were photographed at the State Crime Laboratory and then decently disposed of. When questioned, Gein told investigators that between 1947 and 1952, he had made as many as 40 nocturnal visitors and 3 local graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies, and what he says he was in a daze-like state. On about 30 of those visits, he said that he came out of that daze while at the cemetery, left the grave in good order, and returned home empty-handed. On other occasions, he dug up the graves of recently buried middle-aged women, and he thought resembled his mother, and took their bodies home, where he tanned their skin to make his paraphernalia. Gein admitted that stealing from 9 graves led investigators to him. Alan Wilimowski, the State Crime Laboratory, participated in opening 3 test graves identified by Gein. The caskets were inside wooden boxes. The top boards ran crossways, not lengthways, and the tops of the boxes were about 2 feet or so below the surface in sandy soil. Gein had robbed the graves soon after their funerals, while the graves were incomplete. The test graves were exhumed because authorities were uncertain as whether the slight Gein was capable of single-handedly digging up a grave during the evening. They were found, as Gein described, 1 casket empty. The other casket was empty, but contained a few bones. And Gein's crowbar and a final casket had most of the body missing, but Gein had returned rings and some other body parts. Thus, Gein's confession was largely corroborated. Soon after his mother's death, Gein began to create a woman's suit so that he could become his mother, to literally crawl into her skin. He denied having sex with the bodies he exhumed, explaining, quote, "They smelled too bad." And during the State Crime Laboratory interrogation, Gein admitted to shooting 51-year-old Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had been missing since December 8th that year, in 1954. Her head was later found in his house, though he denied any memory of the details surrounding her death. The 16-year-old youth whose parents were friends with Gein, who had attended baseball games and the movies with him, reported that Gein kept shrunken heads in his house, which he described as relics sent by a cousin who had served in the Philippines in World War II. Upon investigation by police, these were determined to be human facial skins, carefully peeled from their corpses and used by Gein as masks. During questioning, Sheriff Art Schnelly reported assaulted Gein by banging his head and face into a brick wall. As a result, Gein's initial confession was ruled inadmissible. Sheriff Art died of heart failure in 1968 at the age of 43, before Gein's trial even took place. Many who were Sheriff Art who knew him said that he was traumatized by the horror that Gein's crimes inflicted on him, and this, along with the fear of having to testify in court, especially against assaulting Gein, which caused his death. Now, Gein was considered a suspect in several other unsolved cases there in Wisconsin. In November of 1957, authorities confronted him about missing persons cases that had occurred between the death of his mother and that of Warden. Their suspicions further aroused the discovery of Hogan's remains. Lie detector tests exonerated Gein from many of those murders, but his psychiatrist concluded that his violence can only be directed to women who physically resemble his mother. On November 21st, 1957, Gein was arraigned in the county courthouse for 1 count of first-degree murder, where he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and found mentally incompetent, thus unfit for trial. Gein was then sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, which is now known as Dodge Correctional Institution, a maximum security facility. He was later transferred to the Medona State Hospital in Madison. In 1968, doctors determined that Gein was mentally able to confer with counsel and participate in his own defense. So a new trial began on November 7, 1968, 11 years after, and it lasted less than 1 week. A psychiatrist testified that Gein had told him that he did not know whether the killing of Warden was intentional or accidental. Gein told him that he had examined a gun at Warden's store, and the weapon discharged and killed her. He claimed to not have aimed the rifle at her and didn't remember anything that happened that morning. At the request of the defense, Gein's trial was held without a jury. With Judge Robert H. Gallmer presiding, Gein was found guilty by the judge on November 14th. A second trial dealt with Gein's insanity, or sanity. After testimony by doctors for the prosecution and defense, Gallmer ruled Gein, quote, not guilty by reason of insanity, and ordered him to be committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Gein spent the rest of his life inside that mental hospital. Judge wrote, due to prohibitive costs, Gein was tried only for one murder, that of Ms. Warden, and also admitted to killing Mary Hogan. Now, Gein's house, the outbuildings, and his 195-acre property were appraised at about $4,700, which is equivalent to about $51,000 in today's money. His possessions were scheduled to be at auction March 30th, 1958, amidst rumors that the house and the land stood on what might become a tourist attraction. Early in the morning of March 20th, the house was destroyed by a fire. Deputy Fire Marshal reported that a garbage fire had been set 75 feet away from the house by a cleaning crew, who were also given the task of disposing the refuse. Hot coals were recovered from the spot of the bonfire, but that was not the fire that spread along the ground from the location. Arson was suspected, but the cause of fire was never officially determined. It is possible that the fire was not considered a matter of urgency by the fire chief, Frank Warden, the son of Gein's victim. Gein learned of the incident while in the detention center, shrugged and said, just as well. Gein's vehicle, the Ford sedan, which he used to haul the bodies of his victims, was sold at public auction for $760, which is about $8,300 today. A carnival sideshow operator, Bunny Gibbons, purchased the vehicle. Gibbons was then later charged carnival goers 25 cents admission to see them. The current whereabouts of the Ford sedan are unknown. Gein later died at the Matona Mental Hospital Institute due to respiratory failure, secondary to lung cancer, on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77. Gein is interred by his parents and his brother in Plainfield Cemetery. Over the years, however, souvenir seekers chipped away at pieces of his gravestone until the stone itself was stolen in the year 2000. It was recovered less than a year and a half later in June 2001 near Seattle, Washington, and was placed in a storage unit in the Sheriff's Department, and since then his gravesite has remained unmarked. Thank you very much for listening to tonight's story. Again, my name is DJ, and I'm the host of the Mythical True Crime Podcast. Good night.
Ooh, it's Jackie. Did I scare you? How are we doing so far? Is everyone okay? Do you need a doctor? How about a therapist? Let's see what else the Crypt has in store for you.
In December 1972, 101 people were killed, with several more floating in the shallow, alligator-infested water of the Everglades when Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed. Second Officer Donald Repo was one of those people who perished, along with pilot Captain Bob Loft. Though they died in the crash, they would continue to get on flights again and again, leaving Eastern Airlines Flight 318 feeling quite haunted. Hi, I'm Kayla, host of Tragedy with a View, and this is the Ghosts of Flight 401. If you find that you enjoy this particular story and want more, I will be releasing a full in-depth version on my show on November 12th. I release weekly episodes of the misadventures and mayhem that occur all over the globe while exploring the outdoors. Join me. The flight itself went smoothly, and when they began to approach Miami International Airport, First Officer Stockstill lowered the landing gear. As co-pilot, this was his job. On the dash, there are 3 lights for each of the wheel wells that tell the pilot and co-pilot when the wheels are down and ready for landing. But this time, only the 2 rear wheel lights lit up green. The front wheel light stayed off, indicating that the landing gear at the nose of the plane failed to come out. Generally, when this happens, there is something with the light itself that is faulty rather than the wheel. And even when the wheel fails to come out with the push of a button, it can be done so manually. This is nothing to panic about. Captain Loft simply tells air control that he is going to make a loop around while they address the issue and then come back in for landing. First Officer Stockstill then turns the autopilot on to keep the plane at around 2,000 feet of altitude and moving at about 200 miles per hour so that he and Captain Loft are able to examine the control deck at the same time. Donald Repo, who was the flight mechanic, would end up going down into the small compartment which sits below the cockpit to visually see whether the wheel has come down or not. Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill figure out that it was the light itself that was faulty, as is common, and that the wheel was in fact down. It was 11:42 p.m. First Officer Stockstill began to turn the plane to the left so they could swoop around toward the airport once again when he got an odd sensation of doom. He had noticed the ground coming up to meet them without realizing that this is what it was, and Flight 401 crashed into the Everglades. It would be Bob Marquis who arrived on the scene first. He was out frog hunting with his friend on a flat-bottom boat when he saw the explosion from Flight 401 hitting the water. It took him several moments to comprehend what happened, but when he made his way toward the accident, the sound that rose up was undeniable. It was the sound of people crying out for help. When Bob saw the first victim, he noticed it was a man in only about a foot of water, but he was struggling to keep his head above the small waves. His head was bloody, and when he shined the light around the water surrounding them, Bob saw body after body floating in the water. Some were still strapped into their seats. But it would be the things that happened away from the wreckage that leaves a chill no one can explain. Sadie Messina, the wife of Rosario, who was a passenger on the plane, was standing in the airport waiting for her husband to arrive when she heard his whistling of a song. He loved this song and whistled it frequently, but when she turned to find him, he was not there. When the plane crashed, multiple people mentioned that they saw flight attendant Stephanie Stanish struggling out of the plane and then clumsily staggering her way through the swamp, which we will later learn was impossible because investigators found that she had died on impact. In March of 1973, nearly 3 months after the crash into the Everglades, Eastern Airlines Flight 318 was flying from New York to Fort Lauderdale in Florida. While preparing meals for passengers, one of the flight attendants, Denise, went into the plane's galley to help heat up some meals. In this area, there is a refrigerator and ovens, and when she stepped into the space, she noticed that Ginny, another flight attendant, was no longer there. She didn't pay any mind to this, though, and got to warming up meals. Suddenly, she felt that she was no longer alone, but when she turned around, she saw no one was there. She thought that maybe Ginny or one of the other flight attendants was playing a trick on her, and so she began to open all of the doors. That feeling of not being alone only intensified when she found no one was there. Then there are odder stories, like that of a different flight on Flight 318, where Sis, a flight attendant, was making her way down the row counting passengers as they settled in for their flight. She was doing this to quickly identify if everyone was on board, and when she was done, she realized that they were over by one. As she turned around at the front of the plane, she noticed a man in a pilot's uniform sitting in first class, and she realized that this must be why they were off by one. She assumed that he was deadheading, which is when a pilot needs to get to a different airport to fly a plane, and they will hop on one of the company's other flights to get there. They don't really have to have a ticket or anything, and this was a pretty common thing to have happen, at least in the 70s. But she still needed to be able to identify him and have him on the record for being on the plane. She approaches him and says, "Hi, I'm Sis. Can I get your name, and are you deadheading?" And he just doesn't even acknowledge that she is there. He is just staring directly at the seat in front of him. She repeats herself, and then another flight attendant, Diane, comes over and hears Sis ask for a third time. But he still doesn't answer. By now, the passengers are noticing that this weird interaction is going on, so Sis decides that she is just going to have the pilot, George, come out and deal with this man who just won't respond to her. When George comes out, he kneels down so that he is at the man's eye level. And when he looks into the face of this extra pilot, he is stunned to see Captain Bob Loft staring back at him. George doesn't know Bob because of photos. He was good friends with Bob. George is so surprised that he kind of falls backwards and exclaims, "That's Bob Loft." And everyone kind of turns their attention to George. He's kind of on the ground. He's fallen backwards on his butt. And as they do so, the captain vanishes from his seat. We all know how cramped planes can be, so people are a little bit worried at this point and they're shaken up. They end up delaying the flight and telling passengers to stay in their seats so that way they can search the plane for this man. Many had clearly seen him, and they find nothing. Eventually, they have a safe flight to their destination, but this is just one of numerous reports about sightings of both Bob Loft and Don Repo that were reported over the years. Eastern Airlines would eventually remove and replace all of the repurposed parts from Flight 401, and this ended their sightings. But it hasn't ended the stories of the ghosts of Flight 401. Thank you for listening. If you want to hear more about the story or more of the ghost stories that have come from Flight 401, hop on over to Tragedy with a View on November 12th, anywhere you listen to podcasts. See you there.
Hey there. I'm CJ, host of Rainbow Crimes, formerly Beyond the Rainbow, True Crimes of the LGBTQ+, and I'm the founder of Darkcast Network. I hope you are enjoying the stories our fabulous creators have been bringing you so far. I have a historical case of murder for you that happened on Halloween night in 1958. The place? Charleston, South Carolina. In 1958, Charleston had several bars and clubs that would cater to strictly the LGBTQ community, although the term LGBTQ didn't make its existence known until the mid-1980s. And then it was just LGB, adding the T in the 90s. Charleston also had several bars and clubs that would be both for heterosexuals and homosexuals. These were called mixed clubs. Oftentimes, the mixed clubs, they saw much more of a clientele than the gay-only clubs. The reason being, people were scared. If they were gay, lesbian, or bisexual and their employer found out, it could result in losing their job. That is why the most closeted and curious individuals stuck only to the mixed clubs. 29-year-old Jack Dobbins was a supervisor for a chemical company. But in the evenings, he would often volunteer his time bartending at Club 49. Club 49 was a mixed club. Jack was gay and as open about his sexuality as he dared be in 1958. Jack was kinda cute, albeit a little chubby with some dark, thick eyebrows. Jack shared his home, a pink stucco house on Queen Street, with another young man named Edward Otey. The men were more than just roommates. They were friends, too, just not romantically involved with each other. On Halloween night 1958, Jack and Edward went out to dinner and then to a Halloween party. Jack would leave the party somewhat early as he had promised to bartend at Club 49 that night. As you can probably imagine, clubs on Halloween night were poppin' and jam full of people in costumes. Oh, some wore their regular attire. Some may have even been scantily clad. Although it was the late 50s, nothing like the costumes and shock-type clothing we wear today. Club 49 also had a large crowd that night. 18-year-old John Mahone walked into the club at some point during the evening. John was an airman with the United States Air Force. He didn't have much money with him, but he had enough for a beer or two. He sidled up to the bar and he ordered. Jack was immediately taken with how attractive John was. The two engaged in some conversation. After a bit, Jack began serving John beers on the house. A few hours later, around 2 a.m., Jack's shift was nearly over, and John was still at the bar. Jack thought he and John were vibing, and he was into it. He invited John to go to another bar. John agreed to, but said he didn't have much money on him. Jack laughed and shoved some dollar bills into John's pocket as the two headed off to another bar. Jack wanted to take John somewhere upscale, so they went to the Elbow Cocktail Lounge. However, when they got to the door, the men were denied entrance because John's blue jeans and leather jacket did not coincide with the lounge's strict dress code. Jack shrugged and told John, "Why don't you just come back to my place? The bourbon there is much better than it would be here anyway." John said, "Lead the way," and the two men walked to the Pink House on Queen Street. Jack's roommate, Edward, was already upstairs in bed by the time Jack and John entered the residence. Jack went into the kitchen to make some drinks. Early the following morning, Elizabeth, the housekeeper of the pink stucco house on Queen Street, she used her key to let herself in. To her horror, she found Jack lying naked on the living room couch. He had dried blood stuck to his head. Jack was holding a candlestick against his chest. Elizabeth quickly called the police. After the police arrived and inspected the crime scene, they spoke to both the housekeeper and to Edward, the roommate. Edward had slept throughout the night, and he hadn't awoken to any sounds coming from the house. Now, don't forget, Edward was at a party before coming back home, so he might have also been intoxicated. Going back a little bit to that prior night, upon leaving Jack's house, John went back to his Air Force barracks. He bragged about how he had beaten and robbed a queer to some of his fellow airmen. He showed them his bounty. He got a lighter, a key, and $23. That was his big haul. But later that day, John saw in the newspaper the headline read, "The Candlestick Murder." Below was a picture of Jack Dobbins sitting in a chair reading a book. John saw it was the man who had been so nice to him on Halloween night, the man who had provided him with free beers, given him some cash, and invited him back to his home. That man had died. John was sure when he left Jack's house, he'd only hit him enough to make him unconscious, not to kill him. But John ended up turning himself in to authorities. At John's trial, his account of what happened that night from the time they got back to Jack's place went something like this. John sat on the couch in the living room while Jack went in the kitchen and poured each of them a highball glass of whiskey. Jack came back out of the kitchen with the drinks, and he sat on the couch next to John. Jack then began to make some uncomfortable comments to John. John excused himself to use the bathroom. When he came out of the bathroom, he found Jack standing naked in the living room. Jack said, "Come over here, John." John said he panicked and ran up the stairs trying to look for an escape. He went into Jack's room, and he grabbed one of two 2.5-foot long candlesticks. Then he made his way back downstairs. He told Jack, I just want to leave. He stated Jack made another sexual advance towards him. So he started to swing the candlestick at Jack's head, and he made contact 3 or 4 times until Jack fell backwards onto the couch, into what John figured was just an unconscious state. And then he got the hell out of there, and he went back to his base. Many have questioned if John was so freaked out by being hit on, or even around a gay man, why in the first place would he even go to a bar with mixed clientele? There were an abundance of straight bars he could have went to. Why did he stick around so long at the bar after he bought the 1 or 2 beers that he could afford? Why not just leave after his money ran out? Why agree to follow a man he just met, to the man's home? He must have known what Jack was after. And why would he run upstairs to escape? Why didn't he just go through the front door that he came in? And why not just threaten to hit Jack with the candlestick and safely see himself out the door? Something more must have been going on, other than what John offered up as his story. John would be arrested and charged with Jack's murder. At his trial, he would have an all-male jury. The prosecution went after the death penalty, claiming John committed murder during a botched robbery. After 3 days of the court proceedings, the jury came back with a not guilty verdict, citing that the victim was a deviant, and John was freed. I sure hope the ghost of Jack haunted John and that jury for the rest of their days. This has been CJ, host of Rainbow Crimes, on the Darkcast Network. Happy Halloween, everyone.
Greetings, my dear witches and spooky listeners. This is a bonus haunted episode for Halloween, or Samhain, as us witches know it to be, from Swales, the friendly green witch of the Bell Witch podcast. Today I'm going to tell you about a gruesome haunting at a Britannia hotel I actually have had the pleasure in staying in twice whilst doing a spot of ghost hunting. It is true, I heard knocks and creaks and saw flashing lights on the gizmos and gadgets. In some rooms there is a feeling of being watched and a foreboding sense when you go to touch the piano in the grand hall. It does make me think, perhaps I shouldn't do that. Bosworth Hall in Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, UK. A beautiful, grand manor house with huge staircases and detailed paintings of those that may haunt the halls today. If you imagine a stately home, you will envision this beautiful place with its mahogany detailed banisters and beautiful decored rooms. It is a very impressive place. A courtyard with a charming woods surrounding beautiful grates and, strangely, a prison door within one of the bars that is an actual door from a local prison. The neighbouring structure is a 700-year-old church, complete with gargoyles and grotesques of different natures. A graveyard of old accompanies the church and is indeed in need of a little TLC. The quaint little town of Market Boswell is a host to thatched roof houses and even a building where children's fingerprints have been fired within the structure of the bricks, giving it a foreboding, haunted feeling from those kids who perhaps died in the fire as they made the bricks in Victorian slave labour. It is not a surprising setting for perhaps a genuine haunting. Some say if you walk the grounds of Bosworth Hall on a still autumn night, when the mist clings low to the earth and the wind dares not whisper through the trees, you might hear her, the light, almost mournful footsteps on the grand staircase. And if you're truly unlucky, you might see her. Take a breath. For this is the spectre or the ghost that is known locally as the Great Lady of Bosworth Hall. She is said to wander the corridors of Bosworth Hall at night, as if time had forgotten her, and perhaps it has, for she has walked them for over 200 years, trapped between this world and the next. Bosworth Hall, nestled in the Leicestershire countryside, has stood here since the 17th century. its ivy-covered facade hiding centuries of secrets. And although it has had many a do-up, buildings added, transformed and altered throughout the times, it still hasn't changed in its strange dark vibes. It was once the proud seat of the Dixie family, a line of baronets with wealth, status and whispers of scandal. One such whisper was that of Lady Dixie, believed to be the spirit of the Grey Lady today. Her name was Anne. Some say she was the wife of one of the younger baronets. Others say she was the daughter of the Sir Walston Dixie of the manor. We'll never know for sure. Young, sweet Anne Dixie, who arrived at the hall full of hope, only to find herself ensnarled in a lonely, loveless marriage. Sir Walston Dixie, her husband, or an unloving father, was a stern, controlling man, a magistrate known for his cruel justice and cold demeanour. The locals feared him, his servants obeyed him without question, and Anne, she suffered in silence. Some say she fell in love with another, perhaps a tutor, a stable hand, or a gardener, a forbidden romance that, when discovered, ended in tragedy. When her husband stroke father found out of this forbidden love, he was horrified and outraged, and set a series of man-traps throughout his stately home in secret, hoping to snare the unsuspecting snake in the grass that was taking this young woman away from him. Was it a bear trap, an automatic crossbow, a hole to fall in, perhaps a mechanism to impale the poor unsuspecting human? Nobody knows for sure because there are no records. But it went bad, as these things often do when, unfortunately, the trap snapped close, not on the unsuspecting young man, but actually on Anne herself. Desperately and fighting for her life, seeking help, she crawled up the stairs of the manor house, calling out people's names, servants' names. Nobody seemed to hear her. Poor Anne, it appeared she was completely alone. Desperately seeking assistance, it is said that she crawled up the staircases on her hands, dragging her broken body behind her, leaving a long streak of blooded carpet as she went. Desperate to cling on to her life, she found herself in her room, lay on her bed and prayed somebody would rescue, find her, assist her in this devastating situation. Some say she died instantly, while others say she were left for some time, suffering in absolute agony, desperately clinging on to her soul. It must have been hell. Could it have been hours? Could it have been days? Others tell it differently, that she died of sorrow alone in her room, abandoned by a man who saw only hairs, not affection. But all these tales end the same, with her spirit, cloaked in a soft grey gown, gliding through the halls, searching for her lost love that never came to her rescue or sat by her side as her poor soul slipped away. The guests at Bosworth Hall now a Britannia hotel, and a delightful wedding venue with a very nice spa, have reported cold spots in otherwise warm rooms, the sudden scent of lavender where no flowers grow, and the feeling, unmistakable, of being watched, whether by the grey lady or the evil man that set the traps. There has been reports that strange blotches appear on the ceiling and on carpets that resemble something like blood, dark slime that cannot be removed and can disappear just as it has appeared, that's there and then gone. Guests catch something at the corner of their eye, on the ceiling or on the floor, and when they turn to look, well, there's nothing there. A housekeeper once told of entering room 7 to prepare it for the next guest, only to find the bed had already been disturbed, and an imprint on the pillow, as though someone had just risen. The windows were locked, the door had been bolted from the inside, although it hadn't been used the night before. But the room was occupied by someone or something. Another guest claimed to see a pale woman in the hallway in the middle of the night. She did not speak, she only stared, eyes dark and sorrowful with longing, before she turned and vanished through the wall. They say she appears most often on October nights, when the moon is high and the veil is thin between the worlds. And if you ever stay in Bosworth Hall, as I have done on 2 occasions now, and wake in the dark to the sound of sobbing, don't rise, don't open your door, and above all, don't follow the footsteps as they descend up the grand staircase, because once she knows you can see her, she may never leave you alone.
I see you.
This grey lady of the stately home, Bosworth Hall.
The Pacific Northwest is a geographically diverse region of the U.S. and Canada.
Characterized by its majestic mountains, dense forests, rugged coastlines, and deep river canyons.
But it has also been the home of many who kill. Thank you for joining me, Carmita,
and me, CJ, for Murder in the PNW. Hey, Carmita. This case is unresolved. Law enforcement thought that they had her killer in custody, and 9 years later, the guy gets acquitted. But we'll get more into that as our case evolves. 24-year-old immigrant from India and recent college graduate Arpana Janaga, she seemed to have her life together. She was a software engineer for Dell Computers in Bellevue, Washington, which is just across the lake from Seattle. She had a degree, a good job, her own apartment. She volunteered at a local animal shelter. She volunteered at a fire department, and she had a load of friends from all the places and all the things that she was involved in. Arpana also loved riding her motorcycle, which made her something of a free spirit. Dell Computers, the company that she was employed by, they said she was very talented, that she was very bright, and she was very outgoing and a rising star.
Girl was making that money for sure.
Yeah, she was.
Young, beautiful, and making that money. Go queen. Well, on Halloween night, 2008, which happened to be a Friday that year, Arpana and several other residents of the complex that she lived in were hosting a Halloween party. Attendees were mostly other people who lived in the building. They would filter in and out of the host apartments, sharing their costumes, eating, drinking, intermingling, and such at different intervals during the night. There were, however, at least a dozen or so people who did not live in the complex that came to enjoy the festivities, as, most places with parties that happen. The guests in Arpana's apartment would leave a little after 9 p.m. to go to another apartment host's party. Arpana, in turn, would lock her door when her apartment was cleared and go join the other parties too. This went on until the early hours of the morning.
Sometime around 3 a.m., Arpana decided that it was time for her to go home and go to sleep. She bid her friends at the apartment on the first floor goodbye, and she headed back upstairs to her third-floor apartment. Sometime between 3 a.m. and 8 a.m., Arpana's nearby neighbors were awoken to moaning sounds coming from Arpana's apartment. They went back to sleep assuming that she and a partner were having consensual sex. But around 8 a.m., her neighbor right next door heard an eerie growl that lasted nearly 20 seconds, and then they heard a thud. They then heard footsteps and water running for almost an hour. The neighbor didn't think too much about it and went about their day.
On Monday, November 3rd, Arpana didn't show up for work, and her parents in India were worried when they couldn't reach their daughter by phone all weekend. They asked a family friend named Jay if he would go by and check on Arpana. Jay went to her apartment complex where he bumped into one of Arpana's neighbors, a man named Cameron Johnson. Jay asked Cameron if he knew Arpana and if he'd direct him to her apartment. Cameron willingly obliged the stranger, and the two men walked to Arpana's unit. At very first sight, the two men noticed Arpana's door appeared to have been forcibly kicked in. They proceeded to enter. Once inside, they walked around and then into Arpana's bedroom. Her naked body lay face down on the carpet of her room. She had been partially covered with a cloth. Arpana had been gagged with her own underwear shoved into her mouth and duct taped over it. She appeared to have been beaten about her head. There was a thin ligature mark around her neck, and there was strong evidence she had been raped.
Arpana's hands were covered in blue toilet bowl cleaner. Motor oil had been poured over her body. Her fingers and fingernails had been cleaned, removing any defensive DNA that could have been under her nails. She had burn marks here and there on her body, suggesting that someone had tried to light her on fire, but they were unsuccessful. Arpana's bed had been stripped. Her comforter was soaking in bleach in the bathtub, and a fleece blanket had been partially burned. The apartment reeked of bleach, and there were bleach spots all around in various areas of her rooms. Police searched not just Arpana's residence, but the complex's trash dumpster also. There they found a bag containing Arpana's Halloween costume, a bloodied robe, an empty quart bottle of motor oil, and a shoelace from a boot. This was assumed to have been the murder weapon.
Detectives quickly got busy interviewing residents at the complex. They asked for pictures taken that night. From the pictures, they were able to find a scattering of the people who didn't live at the complex. They discovered names of the non-residents, and one became a person of interest. A man named Emmanuel Fair had been staying with someone who did live in an apartment there. Emmanuel was a convicted felon and had served time for weapon and drug offenses and a rape conviction in 2004. Another person of interest also caught their eye. Neighbor Cameron Johnson, the guy who led Arpana's family friend Jay to her apartment. Apparently, Cameron had a big crush on Arpana, and he had done some odd things after Arpana was murdered. There was a record he had called Arpana around 3 a.m. Then he tried to scrub that evidence from his phone. But he told detectives he didn't remember making that call. He also told detectives on November 1st he drove to Canada but was denied entry.
Cameron's computer showed a search of pawn shops near the U.S.-Canadian border. When he went to the police station for questioning, the cops took notice of Cameron limping and favoring one elbow. He quickly told law enforcement it was due to an arm wrestling incident. But probably one of the weirdest things from Cameron was that he asked family members and close friends, "What if I did the murder and I just don't remember?" Emmanuel and Cameron did talk the night of the Halloween party. They even went and sat in Cameron's car for a bit to listen to music. Emmanuel stated that he went back to his friend's apartment around 1:30 a.m., but his phone records show that he was making phone calls between 2 and 5 a.m., including some to the woman whose apartment he was staying at.
DNA from 3 males were found at the scene of the crime, but Arpana did have guests there for the party. 2 sets of DNA belonged to Emmanuel and Cameron. Emmanuel's DNA was found on Arpana's neck and on the piece of duct tape that covered her mouth. It was found mixed with her blood on the bathrobe that was tossed into a bag in the dumpster. Cameron's DNA was found on the discarded bottle of motor oil that was also found in the bag in the dumpster. It was reported in the Seattle Times an unknown male DNA was found on the shoelace from the boot.
Manuel Fair was the only man charged with Arpana's murder in 2010. His case didn't go to trial until 2017, and then the jury deadlocked, and the affair was called a mistrial. Emmanuel was back in court in 2019. This time, the jury came back with a not guilty after hearing all the supporting evidence that Cameron was Arpana's killer. Emmanuel was released in 2019 after serving 9 years with no conviction. He's suing the county for wrongful detainment. Cameron has never been charged for involvement in Arpana's murder.
It's been 17 years now since Arpana Janaga was brutally murdered in her own apartment. There has been no justice for the 24-year-old who had such a bright future ahead of her.
You know, Carmita, I kind of feel that Emmanuel was guilty along with Cameron and maybe another man. What do you think?
Oh, definitely. I mean, DNA for one doesn't lie, and there's so much evidence. I mean, I don't know about this Emmanuel guy, but there was so much evidence against Cameron that he definitely wasn't involved.
Well, the DNA, like you said, doesn't lie, and Emmanuel's DNA was on the duct tape that covered her mouth. It was also around her neck.
Yeah, like,
I also think Cameron had a hand in it, too. Why is he calling her at 3 a.m.?
Definitely.
Well, we thank you for joining us, and we hope you will add Murder in the PNW to your favorite podcast list.
Thanks, Darkcast. We are happy to have Murder in the PNW as part of your incredible lineup of shows. Stay alert, stay vigilant, and always keep your head on a swivel.
Hey everyone, my name is Raven, and I'm the host of Rogue Darkness. In this Halloween special episode, courtesy of the amazing Darkcast network, I wanted to discuss the unsettling case of a small cult from Sonora, Mexico, known for their dedication to Santa Muerte, also known as Saint Death, a deity in Mexican folklore, and how the cult committed horrific murders as ritualistic sacrifice to their deity. So now, let's start off from the very beginning. A woman by the name of Sylvia Meraz, who would eventually become the leader of an immensely small but nonetheless severely brutal cult, was born in Hermosillo, Sonora in 1968. It's been reported that Sylvia's family lived in poverty within a poor neighborhood of Nacazari de Garcia municipality in Sonora. At just the age of 16, Sylvia gave birth to her first son, Ramon Omar Palacios Meraz. She would then go on to have 3 more children with her first husband, Martin Barón López. The children were Ivan Martin, Francisca Magdalena, and Georgina Guadalupe Barón Meraz. When Sylvia was 29 years old, she had her last child, her daughter, who she named Sylvia Yahara. Facing struggles throughout her entire life, Sylvia ultimately became convinced that she could and would receive financial help from deities if she offered the ultimate sacrifice, life. It was at that time that Sylvia decided she needed to perform human sacrifices in order to gain the favor and help of her personal revered deity, Santa Muerte, also known as Saint Death. Motivated by her delusional ideas of presumed power and the potential of gaining financial help from the other side, Sylvia orchestrated the sacrifices with the other individuals who ultimately joined her cult, which ended up including 4 of her 5 children, Ramon Omar, Francisca Magdalena, Georgina Guadalupe, and Sylvia Yahara. Along with her children, there was also Sylvia's father, Cipriano Meraz, her partner at the time, Eduardo Sanchez, and also another woman named Zoila Hada Santa Cruz Ariqui. Together, they systematically planned out their murders to use ritualistic sacrifice as a means to gain approval and favors from Santa Muerte. Beginning in 2009, Sylvia had picked her first sacrificial victim, her 55-year-old friend Clotilde Romero Pacheco, who was ultimately found dead in December of that same year. Clotilde Romero was known by the locals as a lady who sold popsicles. She reportedly had no close relatives, living or otherwise known, which made her an unfortunately easy target for Sylvia and the others of the cult. On the day of the murder, Sylvia had told Clotilde to pick up a 20-peso note that she saw off the ground as they were walking together. But unfortunately, when Clotilde bent down to pick up the money, she was then swiftly struck in the neck with an axe, being instantly decapitated. Sylvia had just made her first human sacrifice. Now with Clotilde dead, the group made an offering of her blood to Santa Muerte in an attempt to obtain protection, and then they went on to burn and bury Clotilde's body near Sylvia's family home. The next murder wouldn't take place for a few months going into the next year in June of 2010. 10-year-old Martin Rios Chaparro Sanchez Urrieta, who was the biological son of Eduardo Sanchez, Sylvia's partner. Martin was also the adopted son of Sylvia herself. Martin was the cult's next chosen victim, and he was ultimately murdered in June of 2010. Sylvia reportedly had gotten the young boy drunk and then had her youngest daughter, Sylvia Yahara, who was just 13 years old at the time, stab Martin repeatedly for a total of at least 30 times. While young Martin was still alive even after the brutal stabbing, the group then held a small ritual around him where they proceeded to cut his veins and then spread his blood around an altar while he bled out. The third and final victim of the cult was another 10-year-old boy named Jesus Octavio Martinez Yanez. He was the adopted son of Ivan Martin Barón Meraz, Sylvia's son, and so was therefore Sylvia's grandson. Jesus was murdered just a month after Martin in July of 2010. This time around, Sylvia reportedly held Jesus in front of the altar while one of her daughters brutally slaughtered him, decapitating him like the victims before him, and then draining him of his blood to spread across the altar for Santa Muerte. Investigations into the crimes began after Jesus Martinez was reported missing by his mother and his mother's boyfriend. Investigators looking into the missing persons case initially thought that young Jesus might have been kidnapped by a human trafficking network due to some alleged eyewitness sightings of Jesus near the Arizona border begging in the street. This theory, however, was quickly ruled out due to a lack of evidence and the reliability of the eyewitness accounts not being very viable. After 2 years of ongoing investigation into the missing persons case of Jesus Martinez, in March of 2012, Sylvia, along with the rest of her family living in her home, were implicated and arrested for the murder of Jesus, as his body was eventually found under the floor of Sylvia's youngest daughter's bedroom. The other 2 victims' bodies were discovered shortly thereafter in an unpopulated area not far from Sylvia's home. The state police actually discovered the bodies during an unrelated investigation and were then able to tie Sylvia to the crimes. Sylvia Meraz and the other 7 members involved in the heinous sacrifices were arrested and brought to trial. Sylvia was sentenced to 180 years in prison, while the rest of the adult cult members were sentenced to 60 years in prison. Sylvia's youngest daughter, Sylvia Yahara, was spared prison as she was just a minor at the time of the murders and was instead sent to a youth detention center. Records show that after psychological evaluations were done on Sylvia Yahara, since she had been involved in the cult since her childhood and was surrounded by it on a regular basis, she didn't view the atrocious actions performed as anything other than normal. It's truly heartbreaking how the adult members cause such delusions and distortions into the mind of such a young child to enable them to actually believe murdering another human being in such a callous manner was normal. According to one of Zoila Santa Cruz's daughters, Sylvia Meraz had reportedly threatened to kill the other members if they did not partake in the brutal ritualistic crimes, which is why none of them objected to the murdering of their own family members. Fear, mixed with brainwashing, had unfortunately persuaded them to oblige. We unfortunately see this happen in many cultures, many belief systems, and no matter which deities the sacrifices are being meant for, it's still a horrific crime to have to hear about. May the innocent lives lost be never forgotten. If you enjoyed this episode of Rogue Darkness, be sure to follow me for even more dark tales of true crime and the paranormal. I release new episodes on Friday at midnight Central Standard Time. I also have many of my episodes in live video format over on YouTube, so definitely subscribe there if you like visual storytelling.
Be careful on your way out. The chains may try to keep you here. We hope you enjoyed this Halloween special, Tales of the Darkcast Network Crypt Keeper. If you did, tell all your ghoul fiends about us. Happy Halloween from all of us at the Darkcast Network. I'm Jackie Moranti from Cause of Death, 100 Seconds to Midnight. Stay spooky.